Good afternoon, everyone. The snack lady's still handing out snacks over there if anybody wants one. Anyway, Susie and I would like to welcome you on board our virtual ship, the motor vessel PVE, as we proceed on our journey around the world. Today we will present the natural and cultural history of the Spanish Mediterranean area. We'll visit Cartagena and Barcelona. She's telling me something.
Yeah, slow down because there's still people walking in.
Okay, I can. Barcelona, Spain. Along the way, we'll provide edutainment by presenting some of the local personalities. Now, who here recognizes what's in that picture? Anybody? Okay, that's a set of chimneys designed by Antoni Gaudi, and it's on top of a building called Casa Mia in Barcelona. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. We virtually sailed from England, jolly old England, and now we're entering the Strait of Gibraltar. Its name originates from the Arabic word Jebel, or Gate of Charity. It is one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. The strait separates Europe and Africa by less than 8 miles at its narrowest point. The narrowness of the strait limits the mixing of very cold, less saline Atlantic water and quite warm, salty Mediterranean seawater. It mixes at a depth of about 3,300 feet, so it's not something you have to worry about when you're swimming. Anyway, the Mediterranean water is so much more salty than the Atlantic that it flows out to form a very highly saline bottom water that's called the Mediterranean outflow. That Mediterranean outflow can be traced for thousands of miles out into the Atlantic before it loses its identity. It slowly becomes less saline until it becomes equal to the Atlantic Ocean water. The Rock of Gibraltar on the southern tip of the Spanish peninsula is 1,400 feet high. It was created about 200 million years ago when the African tectonic plate collided with the Eurasian plate. That fender bender formed a mountain range that dominates the peninsula. The Rock of Gibraltar consists largely of limestone. Calcite, which is the most common mineral in limestone, dissolves slowly over time in rainwater, and as a result, the rock has over 100 caves. The Rock of Gibraltar is also home to around 250 Barbary macaques. That's the only wild primates that are found in Europe. Its name refers to the Barbary coast of northwest Africa. This is one of the best-known Old World monkey species. Its population at the rock appears to be stable and maybe even be increasing slightly because they get well fed by the tourists. Anyway, the North African population seems to be in decline. Macaque troops of 10 to 100 different individuals are matrilineal. The hierarchy is determined by lineage from the senior female, the lead female in a troop. The Barbary macaque is of particular interest because the males play I guess you'd call it an atypical role in rearing the young. Because of uncertain paternity, males are integral to the whole raising of all these different infants. The males may spend considerable amount of time playing with and grooming the young. In this way, there's a very strong social bond that's formed between the male and the infants. Both males own offsprings and those of some other guys in the troop. Grooming others leads to less stress levels for the individuals that do the grooming. And it may also be explained by the social relationships and the support within the troop that are formed by it. Gibraltar, circled here in red, is that funny looking point, is bordered to the north by Spain. It was captured by the Anglo-Dutch forces in 1704 during a war with Spain. The territory was soon ceded to Great Britain in perpetuity. Everybody knows what that means, right? Well, most of the time you know what that means, but occasionally, anyway. During World War II, it was an important base for the Royal Navy as it controlled the entrance and exit to the Mediterranean Sea. It remains strategically viable because half of the world's seaborne trade passes through the strait. There's a labyrinth inside the Rock of Gibraltar known as the Great Siege Tunnels. They're arguably the most impressive defensive system devised by man. Of course, there are probably some modern ones that people could argue about. It was excavated between 1779 and 1783, and the tunnels allowed the mounting of guns to be aimed at enemy positions. As a little bit of an aside, most of the guns are aimed to the north towards Spain. The tunnelers relied on the strength of their arms, sledgehammers, crowbars, and of course the all-popular gunpowder for blasting. In 5 weeks, 18 men had driven the tunnel 82 feet into the side of the mountain. Soon the tunnel was all of 370 feet long. Well, during the Second World War, probably using a little more sophisticated equipment, 33 more miles of tunnels were added to the system. The sovereignty of Great Britain is still a point of contention. Because of its location, the Strait of Gibraltar is widely used for illegal immigration between Africa and Europe. Locals have repeatedly rejected proposals for Spanish sovereignty. Beginning back in 2018, Spain decided it would no longer object if Gibraltar left the EU with Britain. Excuse me. Now let's take a closer look at Spain and the Balearic Islands, known as Majorca and Minorca. The capital of the islands, La Palma, is also the capital of all of them. The name Majorca comes from the Latin meaning larger in comparison to Minorca, the smaller one. The size of Majorca is just over 1,350 square miles. That makes it twice as large as Greater London, but with only 1/10 of the population. Humans have been known to exist on Minorca since at least 4,000 years ago. Some suggest that the first to arrive were from the eastern Mediterranean, such as the Minoans from Crete. Early on, stone slingers were famous throughout the area and highly valued as mercenaries. The stone slingers repelled Greek and Phoenician pirates. To capture the image, you kind of have to think about the biblical story of David and Goliath. These weapons were reported to have been so strong that they could penetrate a ship's hull. Turning the calendar back about 3,500 years, we enter what is called the Teleotic era. It's a tough thing to say. Those are rock structures that are similar to the ones that are shown here. Some were for defense, and they may have been watchtowers as they seem to have been placed in a network. Some were isolated and may just have been territorial markers. Majorca's first inhabitants burned all the forest and plowed the newly cleared ground. That caused a pretty rapid erosion and loss of fertile land. Soon, Majorca's society was threatened with inefficient food production and limited space. The end result appears to have been a diet almost completely based on meat and fish. A taula is a T-shaped stone monument about 14 feet high. They look an awful lot like Stonehenge. Their purpose is unknown, but they seem to have had religious or astronomical uses. In any event, their construction stopped pretty abruptly on the arrival of the Romans in 123 before the Common Era. Majorca was once known as a Sephardic island, and its Jewish population can be traced back to the 5th century. It was also an important center for cartography, where Jews played a pivotal role. One cartographer drew the maps that were used by Columbus. Those came from Majorca. At one time, they publicly professed Catholicism, but privately adhered to Judaism. Why? Well, the Spanish Inquisition in the 14th and 15th centuries included forced conversions. It led to the emergence of the crypto-Jews, or the Zuetas. The Zuetas lived for centuries in their own quarters. Signs of an underground community can still be found today. And the Jewish community on Majorca was fully reestablished in 1971. Here's something that you may not have known. Father Junipero Serra was born in 1713 and raised on Majorca, and that was in the house that's shown here. When Serra was 15 years old, he was taken by his parents to a monastery. He was called to become a missionary to the Native Americans in California, and Father Serra founded 9 missions. Serra was pretty small in stature. He was 5 feet 2 in height, but he was considered a forceful and zealous preacher. He was canonized in 2015, and that granted him the title Apostle of California. Oh, but I digress. We got to get back to Spain. Cartagena, Spain was founded by the Carthaginians. But where were they from? Well, they came from Tunisia, as it is known today. According to tradition, Carthage was founded by the Phoenicians back in 814 BCE. Its Phoenician name means new town. Carthage gained independence around 650 BCE. Their empire is shown here in purple from around 227 BCE. It was a republic that dominated the political, military, and economic affairs of the Western Mediterranean Sea. These people traded copper from Cyprus, horses from Turkey, ivory from India, and tin and silver from Spain. There are only a few ruins left in Cartagena, Spain from the Carthaginian era. One of them is a wall that was built over 2,200 years ago. And the remains there are only 90 feet long, and some of the walls of blocks are maybe 9 feet high. It's located on one of the 5 hills surrounding Cartagena on the isthmus of an ancient peninsula near the entrance to the city itself. Most of the oldest monuments in Cartagena date from the Roman Empire. The most famous is the Roman Theater. In the 2nd century BCE, building began on this theater. It had a capacity of over 6,000 spectators and had a semicircular open space which kind of followed the plan of today's orchestra. In the 3rd century AD, a market was built over the theater. That market was abandoned after a fire caused by the Vandals in 425. Some important Roman ruins in Barcelona were exposed when excavations unearthed a large section of the old Roman city. They found streets, a forum, homes, shops, and even laundries. And they had huge vats for the wine production by the Corkers. That's our own wine group. First, very early Christian communities were established in Barcelona. However, the bishop and several deacons from that really early parish were killed by Rome because they were proselytizing. At the time, the city had a very large Jewish community, and that was tolerated by the Romans. The first governor of the Carthaginians was the son-in-law of Hamilcar and brother-in-law of Hannibal. Hannibal is often regarded as one of the greatest military commanders in history. Now, Barcelona, the city, was originally named Barcino, after Hannibal's family name. The Carthaginians had urbanized culture and an economy that was strongly linked to the sea. Their trade extended across the Mediterranean. Most of their culture was destroyed as a result of wars fought between Rome and Carthage. Well, they didn't lose all of it because the Romans adopted a lot of the elements of Hannibal's military tactics. Hannibal, as you may remember, was famous for his war elephants. They carried his troops to Rome across the Alps, as shown here by the dotted line, starting in Saguntum. In 219 BCE, Hannibal attacked the Roman city of Saguntum. That's about 130 miles from Cartagena. The Roman Senate reacted pretty angrily. They declared that Hispania was a Roman province, and within 5 years, they recaptured Saguntum. Now, it's time for that famous PVE stretch. Now we got to move. You don't have to get up, you just have to move like an elephant. All right, you got to keep moving. We wore them out already. All right, anyway, the fall of the Roman Empire saw Cartagena go into decline, kind of like the elephants. It was occupied successively by the Vandals, the Visigoths, and the Eastern Romans. Now, a large group of Vandals, they were an Eastern Germanic tribe, entered Iberia, the Spanish Peninsula, in about 409 AD. Now, early writers characterized them as barbarians, and that led to the term, ultimately, vandalism, to describe senseless destruction, particularly the barbarian defacing of statues and artwork. The Visigoths invaded Spain in the 5th century, moving west from the Danube Valley. They defeated the Vandals over all of Hispania. Gibraltar became part of the Visigoth kingdom following the collapse of the Roman Empire. The royal family converted to Catholicism, and that brought about the persecution of the Jews in Spain. Spain was controlled by the Visigoth king Roderick, who was seen as a tyrant by his own people. A Spanish nobleman named Julian went to a Muslim military leader in North Africa named Tariq. He asked for help in overthrowing Roderick, who had kidnapped and raped Julian's daughter. I guess it's kind of revenge. In 711, Tariq led an army of thousands to the southern shore of the Spanish peninsula. The result was a decisive victory for Tariq and the death of Roderick. The Muslim armies conquered the rest of the peninsula over the next 7 years. When the Moors arrived in 711, they taxed those who weren't Muslims until the conquest of Barcelona many, many years later. Well, anyway, that began 2 centuries of Muslim rule in Spain and an improvement in the lives of the Jewish population. The Sephardic Jews spoke Arabic, which was the principal language for Sephardic science, philosophy, and even everyday business. High on the rock of Gibraltar are the remains of a Moorish castle. It was built in the early 8th century when the Berbers landed on the rock. All that remains today is a thing called the Tower of Homage, clearly visible due to its dominant and strategic position. The present tower was rebuilt during the second Moorish occupation in the early 14th century. Part of the castle housed the prison of Gibraltar until it was relocated in 2010. Pelagius was a Visigoth nobleman, and he's considered a national hero. He was regarded by many as the country's first monarch. He began the Christian reconquest of the Spanish peninsula from the Moors. It started when a small Visigoth army established a Christian principality. The Muslim population of the region consisted of Arabs, Berbers, and native converts to Islam. The Arabs were generally noblemen from Yemen. That's quite a far away if you think about it. And they were considered the elite population. The Berbers were nomads that came from the Atlas Mountains of North Africa. You can see the changing political climate over time in this slide. It was known as the Reconquista. The northeastern corner was the Christian holdout and an area later known as Catalonia. By the Middle Ages, the fight against the Moors became linked to the fight for the whole of Christendom. The Pope justified acts of war and encouraged Christian knights to seek armed confrontation with Moorish infidels. The Reconquista lasted 800 years. Ultimately, the Visigoths took control. Louis the Pious, he was also called the Fair or the Debonair. He was the king of Aquitaine from 781. He was also co-emperor with his father Charlemagne from 813. They established Catalonia as a defensive barrier against the Moors. They captured Barcelona from the Muslims and asserted their authority over the Basques. Louis appointed several counts to run the show in his absence, and that led to a series of hereditary rulers in the city. Charles the Bald was one of his sons. The last ruler of Barcelona was called Wilfred the Hairy. Hey, I didn't pick these names. I don't know where they came from. In 1137, the Count of Barcelona and Catalonia married the King of Aragon's daughter. And that's considered to be when they created the Crown of Aragon, and the coastal cities became the base of a maritime dominion. Ultimately, Aragon was severely impacted by the Black Death and lost over a third of its population, but it ultimately did recover. When the next king died without surviving descendants, Ferdinand of Castile took control of Aragon. His grandson, Ferdinand II of Aragon, and Isabella I of Castile married in 1469. That's seen as the beginning of the Spanish nation. The crowns of Castile and Aragon maintained distinct territories, and each kept its own institutions, parliaments, and laws. Maybe Isabella and Ferdinand didn't get along all that well. Anyway, 23 years after their marriage, Isabella and Ferdinand ordered expeditions of exploration. Their most famous hired hand was Christopher Columbus. And as we all know, Spain benefited greatly from the wealth of the New World. But that's another story. Now let's talk a little bit about this royal family. Joanna, also known as Joanna, was born the second daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. She was a fretful child, ailing baby who developed into a sullen and timid little girl. But she was intelligent, hardworking, pious, and very well read. At the age of 16, Joanna was betrothed to Philip the Handsome from Belgium. He was the only son of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. A naval fleet with a total of 22,000 people accompanied Joanna to Belgium. 3 sunken ships, and a month later, she disembarked, suffering from seasickness and a severe cold. Worse yet, Philip was not there to meet his new bride. When Joanna and Philip finally met, it was love at first sight for both of them. Although neither spoke the other's language, they ordered the nearest priest to marry them right then and there. The ceremony was hardly finished before the couple vanished into their bedroom. The next day, they had a church wedding to officially complete the union. But as they say, all was not well behind closed doors. Each time they ordered, Philip the Handsome punished Joanna by avoiding her bedroom for days. Despite his unfaithfulness, Joanna remained madly in love with him. However, she was ignorant of politics and became completely isolated at court. She felt lonely in an alien country and was mistrustful of everyone. Joanna gave birth to a daughter, Eleanor, and then a son, Charles. Before 1500, all of Joanna's elder siblings had died. That left her heir to Spain, Mexico, Peru, and the Caribbean islands. 2 years later, that loving couple moved back to Spain. Philip almost immediately wanted to return to Belgium, but Joanna was pregnant again. After a violent quarrel, he left Joanna behind. She lapsed into brooding silences, knowing that her husband, Philip the Handsome, in Belgium, would surround himself with buxom beauties. The Spanish crown hoped that Joanna's wild mood swings were due to her pregnancy. It was a hormonal thing after all. After her son Ferdinand's birth, Joanna became more frenzied than ever. She yelled at servants and cursed at clerics. She wanted to return to her husband, but couldn't because of a war between France and Spain. Eventually, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand let their daughter sail off to Belgium. When she arrived, Joanna found that Philip had a mistress, and in a quarrel with that woman, she cut off the other woman's long hair. Philip confined Joanna to her room, where she went on a hunger strike. During her angry rages, Joanna lashed out at people around her with a stick. She became known as Joanna the Mad. Her mother Isabella died, and Joanna was proclaimed Queen of Castile. In 1506, Joanna and Philip returned to Spain to claim her inheritance. There, Philip and her father attempted unsuccessfully to have Joanna declared incompetent to rule. Both of them tried to persuade her to hand over the government to them. But Philip the Handsome died suddenly at the age of 28. The death of her beloved husband toppled Joanna's mental balance. She could not bear to be apart from his corpse, and from then on only wore black. King Ferdinand had Joanna locked away in a monastery in northern Spain. Her father took over the regency in her name. When he died, Joanna's son Charles came to Spain to claim his inheritance. But first he went on to see his mother. Charles was distressed by that sorry sight, and he wrote to her guardian, quote, "It seems to me that the best thing for you to do is to make sure that no person speaks with Her Majesty, for no good can come of it." End quote. Such a loving son. Doesn't it just touch your heart? Joanna's madness is disputed because she was clearly a victim of the power-hungry men around her. Her father, her husband, and her son all wanted to rule in her place. Her tantrums can easily be explained by her passionate nature and the ruthless way she was treated. Now, after all the centuries, it's impossible to determine if Joanna was actually insane or if she just got a bad rap. Either way, to kind of put her influence into historical context, Joanna was the mother of people who would become, among others, 6 different queens and kings in Europe. It's a pretty impressive lineage. Fast forward 300 years, many wars, many rulers, and of course a few bottles of Spanish sangria. Antoni Gaudí, a Spanish architect, was born in 1852 in the Catalonian region. He was the youngest of 5 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood. When Gaudí was a teen, he became interested in utopian socialism. Throughout his life, he suffered from poor health, including arthritis, rheumatism, and perhaps even tuberculosis. Gaudí's first important work was Casa Vicens, built in 1889. It's a family residence that was constructed and named for a local industrialist. Manuel Vicens owned a brick and tile factory, and the materials used paid tribute to his business. Gaudí designed it of undressed stone, rough red brick, and ceramic tile in a checkerboard and floral pattern. The building site was very small. In fact, if you go there today, the house takes up the entire site. But the house measures over 12,000 square feet on 4 levels. Now, Gaudí was skilled in ceramics, stained glass, wrought iron work, and carpentry. He rarely drew detailed plans of any of his work. He preferred to create them as 3-dimensional scale models, forming the details as he thought of them. Gaudí's better known work is the quarry, and that's the one that the chimney sits on top of. His most famous building is called Casa Mia. Casa Senor Mia was a developer who was criticized for his kind of flamboyant and rich lifestyle. The residents of Barcelona joked about his love of money and luxury. The chimneys that were shown, as I said on the first slide, are on the top of this building. The quarry was a controversial design at the time, even for Gaudí. It has undulating stone facades and wrought iron decorations on the balconies and windows. Another innovative idea in the building at the time was underground parking. There were also separate elevators and stairs for the owners and their servants. The entrance to Park Güell is decorated with a dragon fountain that's the symbol of the park. Park Güell was built in a rugged area of Barcelona with very steep slopes. Gaudí negotiated them with a system of viaducts that were built into the terrain. Park Güell construction began in 1900 and took 14 years to complete. Is that another dragon in front of that? No. It was intended to be a residential estate area in the style of a British garden city. The purpose was to take advantage of the fresh air well away from smoky factories. The site was subdivided into 60 building plots. Ultimately, only 2 houses were built in a development, and neither was designed by Gaudí. One was a model house, but when no buyers came forward, Gaudí bought it himself. He moved in with his father and his niece. He remained single for all of his life and is seen here with his father, niece, and doctor from the top to the bottom. His religion and strict vegetarianism frequently led him to fast. Sometimes his fast became threatening. Antoni Gaudí was often depicted as unsociable and unpleasant. He was described as a man of gruff reactions and arrogant gestures. However, those who were closest to him said he could be quite friendly and polite. Construction of the Sagrada Familia Cathedral began in 1882. Gaudí worked on the project for over 40 years. He devoted the last 15 years of his life entirely to it. On the subject of the extremely long construction period, Gaudí is said to have remarked, "My client is not in a hurry." Who was his client? God. The church has 3 facades dedicated to the birth, passion, and glory of Jesus. It will have 18 towers representing the apostles, the evangelists, and the Virgin Mary. There will be a central tower in honor of Jesus that will be some 560 feet high. Completion of the Sagrada Familia is not expected until at least the year 2027. Gaudí wanted the interior to resemble a forest, which included these columns that look like they are trees with branches. Gaudí's Roman Catholic faith intensified his life, and religious images pervaded his work. One day, as Gaudí was taking his daily walk to church for prayer and confession, he was struck by a tram and lost consciousness. Passers-by thought he was a beggar because of his shabby clothing and his lack of identification. Died as a result of not receiving immediate medical attention. Antoni Gaudí was 73 years old and was buried in a crypt in the Sagrada Familia. The Archbishop of Barcelona proposed Gaudí's beatification. It was approved by the Vatican in the year 2000. Now today, 7 of Antoni Gaudí's works are named World Heritage Sites by UNESCO. And I think he is the only man with anywhere near that number of sites to be honored by them. In 1936, Spain was plunged into a civil war between the government and USSR-backed Communist Party of Spain. The Republican government sent some 10,000 assault guard troops to Barcelona to take control of the city. It was part of a series of similar seizures by the government. The anarchists ultimately lost control of the city. Cartagena was the main base for the Spanish Republican Navy and a stronghold of the Republican government. The city held out against General Francisco Franco longer than any other city in Spain. Franco's first 10 years of rule were particularly violent, autocratic, and repressive. Franco banned Catalan nationalism, republicanism, socialism, and democracy. Despite the ban during the first years and the difficulties of the next period, publishing in Catalan continued throughout Franco's rule. During the later stages of his regime, some folkloric and religious celebrations in Catalan resumed and were even tolerated. Use of the Catalan language was permitted beginning in the early 1950s, but only in the theater. Franco ruled throughout World War II. Much of the civilian population of Gibraltar was evacuated from England, or to England, but the English wanted to fortify Gibraltar against a possible German attack. By 1942, 30,000 British soldiers, sailors, and airmen were on the Rock. It became a key to the control of shipping in the Mediterranean. 50 years after the war, it was revealed that the British had a secret plan to conceal men inside the Rock. A team of 6 men had radio equipment to monitor German movements. They waited under cover for 2.5 years. Well, the enemy never came close to capturing the Rock, so the men were never sealed inside. Directed by the dictator Benito Mussolini, Italian aircraft attacked Spain 13 times. The attacks were requested by Franco as a retribution against the Catalans. Italy dropped 44 tons of bombs aimed at the civilian population. The Cathedral of Barcelona was bombed and more than 1,000 people died. Thousands were estimated to have been injured. In 2013, a Spanish court agreed to investigate Mussolini's air force for war crimes. However, any pilots or officers from that time are most likely dead. Going back as far as Joanna the Mad, there have been movements to establish Catalonia as a separate country from Spain. The Estrada flag is their main symbol. Today's ongoing independence movement can be traced back to the oppression of the Catalan people by Franco. In the last 70 some odd years, the movement for freedom has gained more and more sympathizers. From 2009 to 2011, referendums saw an overwhelming number of yes votes being cast for independence. In 2012, nearly 200 Catalan towns declared themselves free Catalan territory. Kind of sounds like the state of Jefferson, doesn't it? Anyway, a controversial independence referendum was held in 2017. It was overwhelmingly supported, but it was declared illegal by the Constitutional Court of Spain. Juan Carlos was named by Franco as his successor. This photo of the Prince Juan Carlos and his wife, Princess Sophia of Greece, was taken at the Vatican in 1962. Franco, the dictator who behaved like a king, maintained very tight reign over Juan Carlos. The prince met and consulted with Franco many times over while he was heir apparent. The prince took part in official and ceremonial state functions, standing alongside the dictator. This angered hardline Republicans and more moderate liberals. But as the years progressed, Juan Carlos was meeting secretly with the opposition leaders and exiles. They were fighting to bring liberal reforms to the country. Franco remained oblivious to the prince's actions. He denied allegations from his ministers and advisors that Juan Carlos was disloyal to his Franco vision of the regime. In 1956, Juan Carlos's brother, Alfonso, died in a gun accident at the family's home in Portugal. He was just cleaning a revolver when a shot was fired that hit him in the forehead. Rumors surfaced that the gun had actually been held by Juan Carlos when the shot was fired, but nothing ever came of that. Anyway, just 2 days after Franco's death, Juan Carlos was proclaimed King of Spain. That was in 1975, and he was 37 years old. It put an end to 36 years of Franco's dictatorship. King Juan Carlos introduced reforms dismantling the Franco regime. He was hailed for his role in Spain's transition to democracy and for establishing a constitutional monarchy. Yet the king and the monarchy reputations suffered after some controversy surrounding his family arose. In 2014, Juan Carlos, citing personal reasons, abdicated the throne of Spain to his son. Philippe VI was proclaimed head of state by the Congress of Deputies in Parliament. The ceremony was conspicuously short on pomp and circumstance. The country was in pretty bad economic shape at the time. Royalists hoped that Philippe's rule will be a new era of stability for Spain. As an aside, the morning that happened, we were on a ship that was approaching Barcelona, and I had to give a lecture about Spain. and we incorporated that picture in the lecture, and people didn't understand that there was a new king when we arrived in Spain. All right, that's it for today. Next time, we'll virtually sail to the Suez Canal. That'll be on September 3rd at 2 p.m. right here. We'll talk about the history of the canal that reaches back to the time of the Egyptian pharaohs. What have been the impacts on both Egypt and the Mediterranean? And what's all this about a yellow fleet in the Suez? Those are kind of cute things to talk about. Anyway, I'd like to thank you for your time today. Are there any questions about today's talk? Look, I put them all asleep again. Yes, ma'am.
When was the term BCE established? What were the use of BC?
When was the term BCE? I don't know, it was back when they were trying to make everything politically correct. Basically, there were people who objected to BC, meaning before Christ. They wanted to make it before the Common Era because, anyway, it wasn't my choice. Yes, sir.
I flew in and out of ship during the war. That airport now used for jets. The airport in Gibraltar.
Oh, yes, it is. He wants to know if the airport at Gibraltar is used for jet aircraft. Yeah, well, the last time we were there, there's one of those places that the tunnels has a gun looking out. You can look right down over that airstrip, and it's kind of interesting because you see these, they're not really big. They're more like what we would consider the interconnecting the small local jets, not the big. I don't think you could get a 747 or something like that in there, but you could get a 737 if you could find one that flies. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Yep, that's right. We were there, we've been there several times, and if you're going to go to Europe, I agree with her. Barcelona is one of the most beautiful cities on the continent. It's clean. Of course, you got every big city anywhere in the world, it has its own risks, but Barcelona seemed to be pretty safe. They've got these wide boulevards with the huge walking areas that you can walk in, beautiful shopping areas and parks and plazas. One of the other things we learned in Barcelona is right on the cruise ship pier, there's a pharmacy where you can buy almost any prescription drug you could ever think of without a prescription and for pennies on the dollar. And they come from the same place that our drugs here come from. So if you need some, you could fly to Barcelona or take a cruise to get there. Anything else? All right, well, oh, wait a minute.
Who controlled Mallorca and Minorca during the war?
He wants to know who controlled Minorca, Majorca, and all the Balearic Islands. In theory, Spain controlled them, but in reality, I think it was really the Italians that had dominion over them, although Spain still owned them. I don't think anybody other than maybe the Italians controlled them because they had an air base there. All right, well, thank you very much. Have a great evening, and we'll see you in September.